The merciless sun blazed overhead like a furnace in the cloudless sky, casting harsh shadows across the dusty streets of Redstone as Cole Walker pushed through the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The weathered batwing doors creaked on their hinges, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, his spurs clinking against the weathered wooden floor with each deliberate step, creating a rhythmic melody that seemed to announce danger itself. The conversations died instantly, replaced by the uncomfortable silence that followed him everywhere in this god-forsaken frontier town like a plague. Dust particles danced in the amber light, streaming through grimy windows, creating ghostly patterns that seemed to mirror the restless souls who frequented this establishment. The bartender, a nervous man named Pete Sullivan, with thinning grey hair and perpetually shaking hands, instinctively moved toward the double-barreled shotgun he kept. Beneath the scarred mahogany bar, his weathered face, etched with lines of fear and hard living, paled visibly as he recognized the notorious figure who had just entered his domain. Cole's weathered face, marked by years of hard living and harder choices, remained expressionless as a granite cliff face as he approached the bar with predatory grace. His dark eyes, cold as winter steel and twice as sharp, surveyed the room with the practiced wariness of a man who'd survived countless gunfights and lived to tell no tales. The patrons shifted nervously in their chairs, their drinks forgotten, as they watched the notorious outlaw who had terrorized stagecoaches and banks across 3 territories for the better part of a decade. Women clutched their shawls tighter, and men's hands drifted unconsciously toward their weapons, though none dared make a move that might be construed as threatening. Cole's reputation preceded him like the shadow of death itself, and everyone in the Silver Dollar knew that challenging him was tantamount to signing their own death warrant. "Whiskey," Cole's gravelly voice cut through the oppressive tension, like a knife through silk. "The good stuff, not that rotgut you serve the locals who don't know any better." His voice carried the roughness of too many nights sleeping under desert stars and too many days riding hard trails through unforgiving terrain. There was something in his tone that spoke of violence barely held in check, of a man who had seen too much blood and spilled far too much of his own. Outside, the annual harvest fair was in full swing, a celebration that brought the scattered ranch families and townspeople together for one of the few joyous occasions in their hard lives. Children's laughter mixed with the melodic calls of merchants hawking their wares, creating a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside. The saloon, fiddle music, drifted through the dusty air like a half-remembered dream, accompanied by the rhythmic clapping of hands and the stomping of boots on makeshift dance floors. Cole could hear it all through the thin walls, the sound of people living, of families together, of hope and happiness that seemed as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. It was a reminder of simpler times, of the life he might have led before he'd chosen the outlaw's path, before circumstances and poor decisions had carved him into the hard man he'd become. The bartender, Pete, poured the whiskey with trembling fingers, the amber liquid sloshing slightly in the glass as his nervous condition got the better of him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the relative coolness inside the saloon, and his Adam's apple bobbed nervously as he swallowed hard. "That'll be $2, Mr. Walker," Pete stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Even speaking to Cole seemed to require enormous courage. Cole tossed a silver coin onto the scarred bar top, the metallic ring echoing in the unnatural silence like a gunshot. The coin spun briefly before settling, and Pete stared at it as if it might explode, as Cole raised the glass to his lips, savoring the anticipation of the burning liquor that would help dull the edges of another empty day. A commotion erupted outside that would change everything. Shouting voices, running footsteps, and then a woman's desperate scream pierced the afternoon air like an arrow through the heart. The sound was raw, primal, filled with a terror and desperation that spoke to something fundamental in the human experience. "Emily! Emily, where are you? Please, someone help me find my daughter." The panic in that voice struck something deep. Within Cole's chest, somewhere in a place he'd thought long dead and buried beneath years of cynicism and violence. He set down his untouched whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light like liquid gold, and strode toward the doors with sudden purpose. The other patrons watched him go with a mixture of relief and curiosity, wondering what could possibly motivate the notorious Cole Walker to involve himself in anyone else's troubles. The blazing heat hit him like a physical force as he stepped onto the boardwalk, the sun's rays reflecting off every surface with blinding intensity. His black hat cast a shadow across his angular features, providing some relief from the merciless glare. The air shimmered with heat waves, and the wooden boards beneath his feet felt like they might burst into flame at any moment. Clara Henderson stood in the middle of Main Street like a statue of despair, her blue dress dusty from her frantic searching, and her face streaked with tears that had already begun to dry in the harsh desert air. Her auburn hair, usually arranged with the careful precision befitting a ranch owner's widow, had escaped its pins in wild strands that framed her desperate expression as she turned in helpless circles, calling her daughter's name until her voice was raw. The crowd around her seemed frozen in tableau, like actors who had forgotten their lines. Uncertainty was written on every face. These were good people, hard-working ranchers and townspeople who would give their last dollar to help a neighbor. But they were out of their depth. A missing child in country this harsh and unforgiving was every parent's worst nightmare, and none of them had the skills or experience to mount an effective search. "When did you last see her?" Sheriff Morrison's voice carried the authority of his badge, but Cole's experienced ear could detect the underlying uncertainty, the fear of a man who realized he was facing something beyond his capabilities. The lawman was competent enough for keeping Saturday night drunks in line and mediating disputes between neighbors, but a missing child was entirely beyond his limited experience in law enforcement. 20 minutes ago, maybe less," Clara sobbed, her voice breaking with emotion. She was watching the puppet show with the other children, laughing and clapping her hands. "I turned away for just a moment to buy her some peppermint candy from Mrs. Peterson's booth. When I looked back, she was gone, vanished like she'd never been there at all." Her words tumbled out in a rush, as if speaking faster might somehow bring her daughter back. Clara's hands shook as she wiped her eyes, and Cole could see the terrible weight of guilt settling on her shoulders, the burden every parent carries when something happens to their child, even when it's not their fault. Cole stepped down from the boardwalk, his boots striking the hard-packed earth with purposeful authority. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, their instinctive fear of him overriding their curiosity. But Clara's tear-filled eyes met his directly, and he saw something flicker there that surprised him. Not fear, but desperate hope. She was drowning, and he represented the only lifeline in sight. "How old?" Cole's question was direct and businesslike, his voice gentler than anyone in Redstone had ever heard it. The change in his tone was so subtle that most wouldn't notice, but Clara heard it clearly. 7, Clara whispered, her voice catching. "She's 7 years old, with blonde curls like spun gold and a yellow dress that her grandmother made for her birthday. She's small for her age, trusting, friendly to everyone. Please, I know what people say about you, but if there's any chance—" "What direction was she facing when you last saw her?" Cole interrupted, not unkindly, but with the efficiency of a man who understood that time was their enemy. His eyes were already scanning the crowd with a tracker's practiced gaze, reading the story written in disturbed dust, scattered papers, and the subtle signs that most people never noticed. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his weathered Colt revolver in a gesture more nervous than threatening. "Now see here, Walker. This is a matter for the law. I can't have a wanted man interfering with official business." Cole's cold gaze fixed on the sheriff with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace that had made him legendary throughout the territory. "How many missing persons have you tracked, Morrison? How many children have you found alive in the desert when the temperature hits 120 degrees? The sheriff's bluster deflated like a punctured balloon. Everyone in Redstone knew that Cole's reputation extended far beyond robbery and gunfighting. Before he'd turned to crime, before the war had taken everything he'd cared about and left him hollow inside, he'd been a scout for the cavalry. One of the best trackers the territory had ever seen, able to follow sign across solid rock and find water where others saw only death. "She was looking toward the medicine show," Clara said quickly, sensing an opportunity in the sheriff's hesitation. Dr. Pemberton's wagon was set up near the livery stable with all those colorful bottles and banners. "Emily loves bright colors." Cole nodded and moved through the crowd with purposeful strides, his movements economical and precise. His keen eyes swept the ground like a hunting predator, reading the story written in dust and footprints with an expertise that bordered on the supernatural. Years of tracking both prey and predators across some of the harshest terrain in North America had honed his skills to an almost mystical level. The crowd followed at a respectful distance, their earlier fear of him temporarily overcome by fascination. At watching a master craftsman at work, Cole ignored them completely, his entire focus concentrated on the faint signs that others couldn't even see. Near Dr. Pemberton's medicine show wagon, with its gaudy paint and promises of miracle cures, painted in bold letters, Cole crouched down like a wolf examining spoor. His weathered fingers traced small footprints in the dirt with the delicacy of a surgeon, reading information that was invisible to untrained eyes. "She stopped here," he said, his voice pitched more to himself than to the gathering crowd, though everyone strained to hear his words. The prince told him a story. Emily had indeed paused by the colorful wagon, drawn perhaps by Dr. Pemberton's exotic potions and his loud promises of miraculous cures delivered with the showmanship of a carnival barker. But then the tracks changed, direction abruptly. No longer the wandering pattern of a curious child, but the straighter line of someone with purpose, or someone being led. Cole's jaw tightened as he read the signs, and a cold knot formed in his stomach. "3 men approached her here," Cole continued, his voice taking on the flat, professional tone he'd used when briefing cavalry officers. "1 stayed back watching, 2 others got close. She didn't struggle at first. They probably told her they were taking her to her mother." The crowd murmured anxiously, and Clara made a small sound of distress. Cole stood, his face grim as winter, storm clouds, and pointed toward the darker part of town where shantytowns sprawled like a festering wound. "They're heading toward the old mining claims," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd with the authority of absolute certainty. "Took her about 15 minutes ago, moving fast but not running. They don't want to attract attention." Shantytown was the ramshackle collection of tents, lean-tos, and abandoned mining shacks where the territory's most desperate and dangerous residents eked out their existence on the margins of society. It was a place where decent people didn't go after dark, where the law was whatever the strongest man said it was, and where a child in fine clothes would stand out like a beacon to those who made their living preying on the innocent. "She's been taken," Cole stated flatly, though everyone had already reached that conclusion. "Whoever did it knows exactly what they're doing. This wasn't random." Clara's knees nearly buckled at the confirmation of her worst fears, and she was caught by Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Morrison, 2 of the town's matrons who immediately flanked her with the protective instincts of their gender. Their faces were pale with shared horror. Every woman in the crowd was imagining her own child in Emily's place. Taken? But why would anyone want to hurt a little girl? Clara asked, though she knew the answer even as she spoke the words. Ransom, Cole said bluntly, seeing no point in gentle deception. Your husband built the largest ranch in the territory before he died. Someone's decided to cash in on that prosperity. The Henderson spread was legendary throughout the region, a vast empire of cattle and land that represented everything the frontier promised to those brave enough and tough enough to claim it. Clara's late husband, Robert Henderson, had been a giant among men, building his fortune through equal parts vision, determination, and the occasional necessity of violence that was part and parcel of frontier life. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. Again, his face flushed with embarrassment and frustration as he tried to reassert his authority in front of the townspeople who looked to him for leadership. Walker, I appreciate your concern, and I'm grateful for your tracking abilities, but I'll handle this investigation from here. You're still a wanted man with outstanding warrants. By the time you organize a search party and figure out which end of a horse track to follow, the girl will be halfway to Mexico or dead in the desert. Cole cut him off with brutal efficiency. I'm going after her now, while the trail is still fresh. You're still a wanted man, Morrison reminded him, his voice taking on a pleading quality. I have federal warrants for your arrest. If you ride out of town, I'll have to then arrest me when I get back, Cole said, already walking toward his horse with determined strides. If I get back. The black stallion tied to the hitching post outside the saloon was a magnificent animal. 17 hands of pure power and speed that had carried Cole out of more dangerous situations than he could count. The horse nickered softly at his approach, recognizing his master's urgency even before Cole touched the reins. Clara broke free from the women supporting her and ran after Cole, catching his arm as he untied the leather reins with swift, practiced movements. Her touch was surprisingly strong for someone who looked so fragile in her grief. Please, she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. She's all I have left in this world. My husband died in a blizzard last winter trying to save stranded cattle, and Emily is everything to me, everything that matters. Cole looked down at her, seeing something in her face that reminded him painfully of his own mother, dead these 15 years from a fever that had swept through their small farming community like the wrath of God. Mary Walker had been a woman of strength and faith who had raised her son to believe in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. I'll find her, he said simply, the words carrying the weight of a sacred oath. But I work alone. This isn't a job for civilians. Take me with you, Clara pleaded, her fingers tightening on his arm with desperate strength. I can ride as well as any man in this territory, and I know this country better than most. I've lived here for 12 years. Cole shook his head firmly. This isn't a Sunday church picnic, Mrs. Henderson. Where we're going, bullets might start. They're flying, and they won't care about hitting a woman. These aren't men with any sense of honor or decency. She's my daughter, Clara said, and the simple statement carried such weight that even Cole's hardened heart felt the impact like a physical blow. The desperation in her voice, the absolute determination that blazed in her eyes despite her tears, reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, the fierce, protective love that drives a parent to face any danger for their child. He studied Clara's face more carefully, seeing the steel beneath the desperation, the core of strength that had helped her survive as a widow on the frontier. Ranch women in this territory learned to be tough as rawhide, or they didn't survive their first winter. They had to be able to deliver foals, treat snake bites, defend their homes from raiders, and keep their families alive when the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride away. Clara Henderson hadn't lived this long by being helpless. Can you shoot? He asked, already knowing the answer from the set of her jaw. Better than most men, she replied without hesitation or false modesty. Robert made sure of that before the cancer took him. Said a woman alone needed to be able to protect what was hers. Cole made a decision that surprised even him, going against every instinct that had kept him alive for years of dangerous living. Get your horse and bring a rifle, but understand this. Where we're going, you do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. No questions, no arguments. Your daughter's life may depend on it. As Clara ran toward the livery stable with renewed purpose, Cole checked his weapons with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that survival often came down to the smallest details. Two Colt .45 peacemakers worn low on his hips in well-oiled holsters, their grips worn smooth by thousands of draws. A Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard, cleaned and loaded just that morning out of habit. A Bowie knife in his right boot, its blade honed to razor sharpness. And a small derringer in his vest pocket, a final surprise for anyone who thought they had him cornered. The familiar weight of the guns was comforting, like old friends who had never let him down. But for the first time in years, he hoped desperately that he wouldn't need to use them. The thought of a gunfight with a 7-year-old child in the crossfire made his stomach clench with dread. Clara returned within minutes, leading a beautiful chestnut mare that showed the quality bloodlines of the Henderson ranch. She had changed into practical riding clothes, leather pants, a cotton shirt, and boots that had seen real use. A Winchester carbine was secured in her saddle boot, and Cole noted approvingly that she handled both horse and weapon with easy familiarity. "Ready," she said simply, swinging into the saddle with fluid grace. The trail led out of town and into the harsh landscape beyond, following the ancient game paths and mining roads that crisscrossed the territory like scars on leather. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by rocky outcroppings, mesas that rose like ancient monuments, and the occasional stunted tree clinging to life in the harsh environment. The sun beat down mercilessly from a brass-colored sky, and heat mirages danced on the horizon like ghostly lakes that promised relief but delivered only more desolation. Cole rode with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, his body moving in perfect harmony with his horse's gait, while his eyes constantly scanned the ground for signs that would be invisible to most people. Clara matched his pace without complaint, her grief temporarily overshadowed by the hope that action provided. She tied her hair back in a practical ponytail and pulled her hat low against the sun, looking more like the frontier woman she truly was than the refined ranch owner's widow she appeared to be in town. The tracks were easy to follow at first. 3 horses moving at a steady pace toward the abandoned mining district that had once been the heart of the territory's economy. Gold had been discovered there 20 years earlier, bringing a rush of prospectors and fortune seekers who had carved a temporary city out of the wilderness. But the easy gold had played out quickly, and most of the miners had moved on to other strikes, leaving behind a maze of abandoned claims, empty buildings, and played-out mines that now served as hideouts for men who preferred to operate outside the law. "There," Cole said after they'd been riding for an hour, pointing to a rocky outcropping about a mile ahead that rose from the desert floor like a natural fortress. "They're holed up in the old Carmichael claim." The abandoned mine was perfectly positioned for the kidnappers' purposes, defensible, isolated, and with water from the old well that had served the miners. It was also far enough from any traveled road that screams wouldn't carry to unwary travelers. "How can you be sure?" Clara asked, though she'd learned to trust Cole's expertise completely during their ride. "The tracks lead that way, and it's the perfect spot for what they're planning," Cole explained, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher instructing a student. "Water from the old well, shelter from the cave system, and only one practical way in or out. Easy to defend against a large force, but accessible enough for a quick escape if things go wrong." As they drew closer, Cole held up a hand for silence and pulled out a pair of field glasses that had served him well during his cavalry days. Through the magnified lenses, he could see movement around the abandoned mine entrance, figures moving with the casual alertness of men who were confident in their position but not entirely relaxed. "I count 3, Cole whispered. handing the glasses to Clara. One keeping watch, while the other two are lounging in whatever shade they can find. Could be more inside the mine tunnels. Clara peered through the glasses, her hands trembling slightly as she focused on the distant figures. One of them was drinking from a bottle, his rifle propped carelessly against a rock. Another was cleaning his fingernails with a long knife, while the third sat in the shadow of the mine entrance, occasionally scanning the surrounding terrain with bored efficiency. "What's the plan?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the fear she felt at seeing her daughter's captors. Cole studied the terrain with a tactician's eye, his mind working through possibilities and contingencies with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. The mine was built into the side of a rocky hill, with the main entrance facing south toward the desert. But he remembered from his cavalry days that there was an old ventilation shaft on the north side, originally dug to provide air circulation for the miners working deep underground. "I go in the front, draw their attention, and keep them focused." "On me," Cole said quietly. "You circle around back to the old ventilation shaft. It should still be open. Might be your only way to get to Emily without going through all three of them." "And leave you to face them alone?" Clara protested. "I've faced worse odds," Cole said grimly. "But if anything goes wrong, if you hear sustained gunfire, or if I don't signal you within 30 minutes, you ride for help as fast as that mare can carry you. And leave my daughter." "Better she has one parent alive than none," Cole said harshly, but his eyes were gentle as he looked at her. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Henderson. This could go badly. These men aren't going to hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way." They dismounted and secured their horses in a small grove of mesquite trees that provided some concealment from the mine. Cole checked his guns one final time, the familiar ritual helping to calm his nerves and focus his mind for what was to come. The Colts slid smoothly in their holsters, and he verified that each chamber held a live round. As they prepared to separate, Clara caught his arm one final time. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't owe us anything. You could just ride away and no one would blame you." Cole was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mine entrance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of years and regrets. "Maybe I'm tired of being the man everyone expects me to be," he said finally. "Maybe it's time to find out if there's anything decent left inside me." The approach to the mine was treacherous, requiring Cole to use every bit of cover the rocky landscape provided, while staying low enough to avoid being spotted by the lookout. The desert heat was oppressive, sweat stinging his eyes and soaking his shirt as he moved from boulder to boulder, with the patience of a stalking predator. His black clothes absorbed the sun's rays like a furnace, but he'd learned long ago that discomfort was just another obstacle to overcome. Pain was temporary, but carelessness could be fatal. Each movement was calculated, each pause carefully timed to coincide with moments when the lookout's attention was focused elsewhere. As he drew closer, he could hear voices carrying on the still desert air, rough laughter and crude jokes that made his jaw clench with controlled anger. These weren't desperate men driven to crime by circumstances beyond their control. They were predators who enjoyed causing pain, who took pleasure in the terror of others. "Pretty little thing, ain't she?" One voice drifted over the rocks, filled with a casual cruelty that made Cole's blood run cold. "Bet her mama would pay real good to get her back in one piece." "Course she will," another replied with ugly laughter. "Henderson's got more money than they know what to do with. Probably won't even miss a few thousand. Question is, how long do we wait before we start sending pieces of her back to Mama?" A third voice added, and Cole's hands tightened on his rifle until his knuckles went white. The casual callousness in their voices reminded him why he'd chosen to live outside society's rules for so long. Sometimes the law wasn't enough to deal with animals like these. Sometimes justice required more direct action. He positioned himself behind a large boulder about 50 yards from the mine entrance and checked his pocket watch. Clara would need another 10 minutes to reach the ventilation shaft and work her way into position. As he waited, a small voice drifted from the dark mouth of the cave, weak and frightened but unmistakably young. "I want to go home." Emily's voice carried on the hot air, filled with the bewildered terror of a child who couldn't understand why these bad men had taken her away from everything safe and familiar. "Please, I want my mama. I'll be good, I promise. I'll be good." The sound of that small, frightened voice sent a wave of cold rage through Cole's veins that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He'd done terrible things in his life, robbed banks and stopped stagecoaches, killed men in gunfights and raids, but he'd never hurt a child, never even threatened one. The men in that cave had crossed a line that he wouldn't cross, had violated something fundamental about the natural order of things. When enough time had passed, Cole stepped out from behind, the boulder like an avenging angel, his hands visible but positioned near his guns, in the classic gunfighter's stance. The afternoon sun was behind him, creating a dramatic silhouette that was designed to intimidate and disorient his enemies. "You boys having a party out here?" he called out conversationally, his voice carrying clearly across the rocky ground. The 3 men spun toward him with startled curses, weapons appearing in their hands with the practiced speed of professional killers. But Cole had chosen his moment well. The sun's glare was in their eyes, making it difficult for them to get a clear view of their target. The leader was a tall man with a scarred face and cruel eyes that had seen too much violence and enjoyed all of it. Jake Murdoch was his name, and Cole knew him by reputation throughout the territory. A killer and worse, he'd been run out of more civilized areas for crimes that decent people didn't like to discuss in polite company. "Well, well," Murdoch said with a cold smile that didn't reach his dead eyes. "Cole Walker himself. Heard you was in town, causing a stir at the Silver Dollar." "Heard you got something that doesn't belong to you, Jake," Cole replied, his voice conversational despite the tension crackling between them like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Little girl's just fine for now," Murdoch sneered, his hand resting on the butt of his gun with casual menace. "Though she won't stay that way long, if you don't turn around and ride away like a good boy. This ain't your business, Walker." "Made it my business when you took her," Cole said simply. Murdoch's 2 companions were spreading out, trying to flank Cole and catch him in a crossfire. He noted their positions without moving his head, years of surviving gunfights having taught him to be constantly aware of every threat, every potential line of fire. "Funny thing," Murdoch continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Never figured you for the heroic type. Thought you were just another killer like me, just better at it." "Maybe I was," Cole admitted, his voice carrying a weight of honest self-reflection. "But even killers have to draw the line somewhere." "Your lead's gonna get you killed today," Murdoch snarled, his patience finally exhausted. His hand moved toward his gun with the fluid motion of a man who had killed many times before. But Cole's draw was lightning incarnate, his Colt clearing leather, and firing before Murdoch could complete his motion. The shot echoed across the desert like thunder, and Murdoch spun away with a scream of pain, his gun flying from his hand as Cole's bullet shattered his wrist in an explosion of blood and bone. The other 2 men opened fire immediately, their shots chipping splinters from the rocks around Cole's position as he dove for cover behind another boulder. Bullets whined overhead with the angry buzz of deadly hornets, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air like incense in a church. Of violence, Cole rolled behind better cover and returned fire, his shots precise and measured despite the chaos around him. One of the remaining gunmen stumbled backward, clutching a wounded shoulder and cursing in pain, while the other retreated deeper into the cave mouth where he'd have better protection. From inside the mine, Emily's terrified screams pierced the air like daggers through Cole's heart. pure terror given voice by a child who had never imagined that such evil could exist in the world. The sound drove him to take greater risks, to abandon the careful tactics that had kept him alive for so long. "Emily!" Clara's voice echoed from somewhere deep inside the mine tunnels, carrying hope and desperation in equal measure. "Emily! It's... Mama, I'm coming for you, baby." Cole charged from cover, firing both guns as he advanced on the mine entrance with reckless courage. The wounded gunman tried to bring his rifle to bear, but Cole's bullets found their mark, ending the threat permanently. The remaining outlaw had retreated into the mine's depths, using the darkness and maze of tunnels to his advantage. But as Cole reached the cave entrance, the sound of running footsteps echoed from within, and the unwounded gunman emerged from the shadows with Emily clutched against his chest like a human shield. His name was Tom Briggs, another piece of human refuse that the frontier seemed to attract like flies to carrion. Briggs held a gun pressed against Emily's head, his eyes wild with the desperate panic of a cornered animal. The little girl's face was streaked with tears and dirt, her yellow dress torn from her ordeal, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. "Back off, Walker!" Briggs shouted, spittle flying from his lips in his hysteria. "Back off or the girl dies right here." Right now. Cole froze, his guns trained on Briggs, but unable to risk the shot with Emily's life hanging in the balance. The child's wide blue eyes found his, filled with terror, but also a glimmer of hope that broke his heart. She was so small, so innocent, so completely vulnerable that Cole felt something crack inside his chest, like ice breaking in spring. "Let her go, Briggs," Cole said, his voice steady despite the rage boiling in his veins. "You hurt that child, and I'll spend the rest of my life hunting you down. There won't be a hole deep enough for you to hide in." "You'll be dead in about 2 seconds, Briggs snarled back, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Soon as I blow, this little brat's brains out, you're next." The shot that rang out didn't come from Cole's gun or from Briggs's weapon. Clara had emerged from the ventilation shaft behind the outlaw, her rifle steady despite the tears streaming down her face, and the rage that threatened to consume her completely. Her bullet took Briggs high in the shoulder, spinning him away from Emily with enough force to break his grip on the child. Emily ran crying toward her mother, who dropped her rifle and scooped her daughter up in her arms as if she would never let her go again. Cole's guns spoke twice more, ending Tom Briggs's reign of terror permanently. In the sudden silence that followed the gunshots, the only sounds were Emily's sobs of relief and Clara's whispered words of comfort and love. "It's okay, baby," Clara whispered, rocking back and forth as she held her daughter with desperate strength. "Mama's here now. You're safe. Nobody's ever going to hurt you again." Cole holstered his weapons and walked over to where Murdoch lay groaning in the dust, no longer a threat to anyone. The outlaw leader looked up at him with pain-filled eyes that still held traces of the arrogance that had defined his life. "Should have killed me when you had the chance," Murdoch gasped through gritted teeth, his shattered wrist cradled against his chest. "Maybe," Cole replied thoughtfully, "but I'm trying to be a different kind of man than I used to be." He bound Murdoch's wounds with rough efficiency, ensuring the man would live to face trial and justice. As he worked, Clara approached with Emily still in her arms, both of them looking like they'd been through a war. "Thank you," Clara said simply, her voice heavy with emotion that went far deeper than mere gratitude. "I don't have words for what you've done for us today." Cole looked down at Emily, who had stopped crying and was studying him with the curious intensity that only children possess. Her face was still streaked with tears and dust, but her eyes held something he hadn't expected. "To see, not fear, but trust. You okay, little one?" he asked gently, his voice softer than most people in Redstone had ever heard it. Emily nodded solemnly and then surprised everyone, including herself, by reaching out to touch Cole's face with one small, dirt-stained hand. "You have kind eyes," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. Not scary, like the people in town said they were. The simple innocence of that statement hit Cole harder than any bullet he'd ever taken. This child, who had just been through the most terrifying experience of her young life, could still see kindness where others saw only danger. He gently took her small hand in his, scarred and calloused one, and smiled. The first genuine smile many people had seen from him in more years than he could remember. Sometimes grown-ups are wrong about people, he told her softly, his voice carrying a tenderness that surprised even him. Sometimes we judge folks by their past instead of looking at their heart. Emily nodded with the serious wisdom that children sometimes possess, then surprised him again by leaning forward and giving him a quick, impulsive hug. The gesture was so unexpected, so purely innocent, that Cole felt tears threatening behind his eyes for the first time since his mother's funeral. The ride back to Redstone was a study in contrasts. The harsh desert landscape unchanged, but everything else transformed by the events of the afternoon. Cole rode point as before, leading Murdoch's horse with the wounded man tied securely in the saddle, groaning softly with each step his mount took. The other two outlaws were draped over their horses. Their reign of terror ended permanently. Clara rode beside Cole, Emily safe in her arms, wrapped in Cole's own jacket despite the heat. The little girl had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her ordeal finally catching up with her now that she was safe. Occasionally, she would whimper softly in her dreams, and Clara would whisper soothing words until Emily settled again. "She'll have nightmares for a while," Clara said quietly, her voice heavy with the knowledge that some scars take longer to heal than others. "Maybe," Cole agreed, "but she's stronger than she looks. Ranch children usually are, and she's got you to help her through it." As the familiar outline of Redstone came into view against the setting sun, Cole could see that word of their mission had somehow preceded them. A crowd was gathered in the main street, and it seemed like every resident of the town was waiting for their return. News traveled fast in small frontier communities, especially when it involved their most notorious resident attempting something heroic. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything Cole had ever experienced in his adult life. Instead of the usual fear and hatred, he saw something in their faces that he'd never thought to see directed at him: respect, admiration, even gratitude. Men removed their hats as he passed, a gesture of honor usually reserved for heroes and the dead. Women smiled at him with genuine warmth, and children pointed at him with the kind of awe usually reserved for legendary figures. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward as Cole dismounted, his face a mixture of relief and professional duty. The lawman looked older than his years, worn down by the stress of the day and the realization of how close they'd come to tragedy. "Walker," Morrison said formally, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, "I have federal warrants for your arrest, multiple charges of robbery, assault, and destruction of property." The crowd stirred uneasily, murmurs of protest rippling through the assembled townspeople. Cole nodded calmly, having expected nothing less. "I know, Sheriff. Just let me see that the girl gets home safe, and then you can do your duty." "No." The voice that interrupted belonged to Judge Hawthorne, Redstone's circuit judge, who made his rounds through the territory dispensing justice where it was needed. He was an elderly man with snow-white hair and a reputation for fairness that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single jurisdiction. The judge pushed through the crowd with the authority of his office, his black robes making him look like a figure from the Old Testament. "Sheriff Morrison, I hereby order you to tear up those warrants." Morrison looked confused, his hand still resting uncertainly on his gun. "Sir, I don't understand. The man is a known criminal. He's committed numerous crimes against, and today he saved a child's life at considerable risk to his own." Judge Hawthorne replied firmly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. He rode into danger when others hesitated, faced down 3 armed killers, and brought that little girl home to her mother. Sometimes the law must recognize that men can change, that redemption is not only possible, but should be encouraged when we see it. The judge turned to address Cole directly, his weathered face kind but serious. "Mr. Walker, as far as the law is concerned, you are a free man. Your past crimes are hereby pardoned in recognition of your heroic actions today. You have my thanks, and the thanks of this entire community." The crowd erupted in cheers that echoed off the surrounding buildings, and Cole found himself surrounded by people who, just hours earlier, had crossed the street to avoid him. Hands clapped his shoulders, voices offered thanks and praise, and for the first time in his adult life, Cole Walker felt like he truly belonged somewhere. Mrs. Patterson, the town's leading seamstress and social arbiter, pushed through the crowd. With tears in her eyes, "Mr. Walker, I owe you an apology. We all do. We judged you by your reputation instead of getting to know the man beneath it." "Ma'am, you had every right to be afraid of me," Cole replied honestly. "I earned that reputation, fair and square, but maybe today is a chance for all of us to start fresh." Dr. Benjamin Foster, the town's physician, approached with his medical bag. "Mrs. Henderson, let me examine Emily. She's been through quite an ordeal." As the doctor gently checked Emily for injuries, finding nothing more serious than scrapes and bruises, Clara approached Cole with an expression of deep gratitude, mixed with something else, determination. "I meant what I said earlier," she told him, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "My ranch needs a foreman, someone strong and capable who can handle trouble if it comes calling again. The pay is fair, the work is honest, and it comes with a house of your own and all the respect that goes with the position." Cole looked around at the faces surrounding him, no longer filled with fear but with acceptance and hope. These people were offering him something he'd never thought possible, a chance to be part of a community, to belong somewhere, to be valued for something other than his skill with a gun. Emily stirred in her mother's arms and looked up at Cole. With sleepy eyes, "Are you going to stay with us?" she asked, with the directness that only children possess. "Would you like me to?" Cole asked, gently. Emily nodded solemnly, and then reached into her small dress pocket, pulling out a slightly wilted wildflower that she'd somehow managed to keep safe during her ordeal. "For you," she said shyly, offering him the flower, "because you saved me and because you're nice." Taking the flower with hands that had killed and stolen, Cole felt something fundamental shift inside him, like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. The weight he'd carried for years, the burden of being the man everyone feared, the isolation of living outside society's boundaries, seemed to lift slightly, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed: hope. "I'd be honored to work." "And for you, Mrs. Henderson," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. As the sun set over Redstone, painting the western sky in brilliant shades of orange, red, and purple, Cole Walker stood in the middle of a crowd that no longer saw him as an outlaw, but as a hero. The transformation wasn't complete. It would take time and effort to fully leave his past behind, to prove that this day wasn't just an aberration, but the beginning of a new chapter in his life. But today had been a beginning, a first step on a long road toward redemption that he'd never thought possible. Sheriff Morrison approached later, after most of the crowd had dispersed to their homes and suppers. "Walker," he said, extending his hand in a gesture of respect and reconciliation, "I reckon I misjudged you. We all did." Cole shook the offered hand, feeling the calluses of honest work and the firm grip of a man who meant what he said. "Maybe we all did, Sheriff. Maybe we all did. If you're serious about staying straight, about making an honest life here, you have my word that the past stays buried," Morrison continued. Far as I'm concerned, Cole Walker the Outlaw died today. The man who took his place is someone I'd be proud to call neighbor. That evening, as Cole settled into his new room above Henderson's ranch house, the first legal residence he'd had in more years than he cared to count, he looked out at the peaceful valley below. Cattle grazed in the moonlight, their dark shapes moving slowly across the silver grass. In the distance, the lights of Redstone twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family, a life, a story of people trying to build something good in a harsh and unforgiving world. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Cole Walker removed his gun belt and hung it on a peg by the door instead of keeping it within arm's reach. The gesture felt strange, almost foreign, but also liberating in a way he hadn't expected. Emily's wildflower sat in a water glass on his nightstand, its simple beauty a reminder of innocence and hope, in a world that often seemed to offer little of either. Tomorrow he would begin his new job, his new life, and his long journey back to the man he'd once dreamed of being, before war and loss had carved him into something harder and colder. Outside his window, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods that lined the ranch house, carrying with it the promise of second chances and new beginnings. For once in his adult life, Cole Walker dared to believe in both. The outlaw was dead. In his place stood a man ready to earn his redemption, one honest. Day's work at a time. In the months that followed, Cole proved himself to be everything Clara had hoped for and more. He threw himself into the work of running the ranch with the same intensity he'd once applied to staying ahead of the law. The hands, initially suspicious of their new foreman's reputation, quickly learned to respect his knowledge, his fairness, and his unwavering commitment to doing things the right way. Under his guidance, the Henderson ranch prospered as never before. Cole's experience in reading the land served him well in finding new grazing areas and water sources. His reputation, rather than being a liability, actually helped protect the ranch from the various desperados and cattle thieves who occasionally swept through the territory. Word spread quickly that the Henderson place was under Cole Walker's protection, and even the most hardened criminals thought twice before tangling with a man of his reputation. Emily recovered from her ordeal with the remarkable resilience of childhood, though she never forgot the man who had saved her. She followed Cole around the ranch when her studies and chores allowed, chattering about everything and nothing while he worked. Her presence reminded him daily of what he was protecting, what he was building toward. Clara proved to be not just an employer, but a true friend, someone who saw past his reputation to the man he was becoming. Their relationship remained respectful and professional, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, a mutual recognition of kindred spirits who had both known loss and were now building something new from the ashes of their past lives. The people of Redstone gradually came to see Cole not as a reformed outlaw, but simply as Cole Walker, ranch foreman, protector of widows and children, and valued member of their community. He attended church on Sundays, contributed to community projects, and even served as a deputy sheriff when Morrison needed help with particularly dangerous situations. But perhaps the most significant change was in Cole himself. The hard edges that had defined him for so many years gradually softened, replaced by something warmer and more human. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, and discovered that he actually enjoyed the company of decent people living decent lives. The wildflower Emily had given him that first day dried and faded, but Cole kept it pressed between the pages of his Bible, a reminder of the moment his life had changed direction, when he'd chosen to be something other than what the world expected him to be. In Redstone, they still tell the story of that hot afternoon when their most feared outlaw became their most unlikely hero. It's a story about redemption, about second chances, and about how sometimes the darkest hearts can find their way back to the light. But most of all, It's a story about how one moment of choosing to do what's right can change not just one life, but an entire community. Cole Walker had found his redemption in the most unexpected place, not in the barrel of a gun or the thunder of hoofbeats, but in the simple act of saving a child and the complex process of learning to live as the man he'd always had the potential to become. The outlaw's tale had ended, but the hero's story was just beginning.